Very good. We'll go ahead and get started. So I'm Scott Sharp. I'm a mechanical engineer with Google, presenting on OCP Ready with Mark Dansie, who's also been a lead on the OCP Ready track within data center facilities. So what we'd intended on talking about today was specific towards Colo site assessments and the information that we're trying to pull together to make it easier to do site due diligence and kind of share some of the low-hanging fruit with base building requirements for data centers. So kind of as noted, I'm Scott, that's Mark. Within OCP Ready, initially when it was kind of founded, it was more so looking at the Open Compute Rack and making sure that there was the data center was compatible with the Open Compute Rack. You could come in, you could take the Open Compute Rack and just drop it in place, no issues. And part of what came through with that is looking at different things like raised floor tile ratings, looking at containment, actual rack form factor and how we would then fit that rack into the data hall, power, cooling, so on and so forth. And with the Facility Ready recognition program, it was a self-assessment that the vendors could use to work through those requirements and prove out that they were compliant with the Open Compute Rack. Through the years, what we found, especially coming from Google, where I work, we have our own site assessment checklists and things that we require, and a lot of times we manufacture our own racks, which creates a lot of problems. So what we've been working on is getting to a point where we've got a hyperscale checklist. And this does not necessarily look at the specifics of how the rack's going to fit on the floor or what the electrical, the mechanical specifics of the data hall are, but looking specifically at what is the logistics requirements to get the rack in, what do the hyperscale companies want for number of loading docks, dock levelers, freight elevators, floor loading. All of those pieces come into play, especially when you look at multi-tenant facilities. Through the years, you'll notice there's quite a bit of information here, and depending on the hyperscale company, they will have different requirements for site access, perimeter controls and monitoring, material lifts, structural information as far as, even going as far as fire rating on walls, barriers between one tenant and the next tenant, between electrical rooms. So a lot of this comes up, and what ends up happening is the hyperscalers go through these assessments before we will actually contract with a third-party company for data center space. What we aim to do here with the OCP Ready checklist for hyperscale is to focus on those base building requirements that are kind of low-hanging fruit, that don't give away any particulars of anybody's rack deployments or densities or technology they're using, but looking at the things that are common to all facilities. So if you look at the flow chart, essentially what we're trying to focus on are those base requirements. Anything in terms of getting into the specifics of what type of bus taps, what type of plugs, those types of things generally with hyperscale deployments are left to fit out. And so what we've aimed at doing is kind of getting those requirements set and then understanding that hyperscalers are going to come in and do their own data hall fit out. So again, just to kind of give you where the opportunity lies and kind of give you some context, depending on the hyperscale company, they will go through and look at pretty much everything. Usually it's hundreds or if not thousands of questions that we ask the suppliers, specifically around anything from how much weight can the freight elevator handle to how many hours between when the elevator goes down to how many hours they will guarantee it gets replaced or fixed. And these all work into the logistics requirements, security, so on and so forth. Through that process, generally the information has to be shared. So with all these symbols, what you're seeing is whether it's Microsoft, Meta, Google, Azure, some of the other hyperscalers, basically we all have these different platforms we want to use for information sharing. And so these suppliers end up having to produce the same documentation in multiple different formats and save them to different locations, which is very time consuming. So what we're looking at doing is getting the metadata for these pieces or these infrastructure sites to where it makes it easier for hyperscale companies to go out and very quickly understand whether this, from a very, very high level, whether it could be compliant or not. And again, these are nothing on the mechanical, electrical infrastructure, but more so very basic. What we would like to do is through this, essentially create a central repository that works into the OCP-ready marketplace where the information can be shared and make it much easier for a company to go out and find if they've got a particular need in a certain location, get the information they need to see, maybe it's a non-starter, maybe they don't have water-cooled systems with that location, maybe it's only air-cooled. Those types of things will come up and will save a lot of time when it comes to doing these assessments, not only for the hyperscale companies, but also for the service providers. What we're aiming at doing as well is bringing together the hyperscale community to standardize some of these items that are non-proprietary and settle on some standards that, similar to like a shopping mall, right? The shopping mall always kind of looks and feels the same, but it's a different company. We're aiming to get those pieces standardized to where we don't have one-offs or we don't have to pay to remediate something that maybe is slightly out of compliance with what we require, but we need the space, so we're going to end up paying for it. The ideal part of this would be, obviously reduced lead times, so time to market would be increased. The infrastructure that would be available would be more compatible with everyone. As the power grids and whatnot get more taxed, allocation from the utility providers to substations is going to become more and more strict. And if you can imagine, if in a certain location, that's the new up-and-coming market, all the power is at this particular location, it's already been allocated, but now it's not compliant with Microsoft or Google or Meta. And at that point, you've got all this power in the right location, but with the pieces that don't make sense. So what we're aiming to do is get those specifications, align them across the companies, and then help publish that. So it makes it easier to kind of we're essentially telling the suppliers what it is that we want. So it really is a win-win because we kind of get what we want, and then the building gets built in a particular way where it's usable and saleable. Well, some of the other items at the bottom that I'm listing here is, the reduced workload for both the hyperscale companies and the suppliers. We can be quite honest with the questions we ask and follow-ups, and we want CFD studies, we want anything and everything we ask for it, and it can be quite taxing, not only for the sales representation, but also the engineering teams. And so through getting some of these low-hanging fruit items out of the way, we can kind of fast-track those efforts. And one of the things that we're currently working on that's kind of for future is with this information being readily available, discussing it with kind of everybody that's participating and making sure that the information is acceptable, so on and so forth, to make sure that there's a mutual agreement. So within the OCP marketplace, which is where a lot of this information would live, what we're looking at is, you can see from just a very, very quick snapshot, and this isn't intended to advertise for anyone in particular, but when you look at the facility, you get the metrics for that data center, whether it be the capacity or site security or what type of certifications they hold is really what we're aiming to have documented. Every site or every hyperscaler will look at different things, and so within the marketplace, if we can cut down on the information that's already there, readily accessible, it will cut down on that overall site assessment and all the requirements that we go through. What it'll also do is also help our contracting process, because the less changes to the specification or things that we have to have improved with the site, those don't get included in the contract because they're already taken care of. Contracting is easier, and the attorneys appreciate it. So just overall, it just smooths everything out and lets us kind of get to the end state quicker and get the capacity that we need. Let's see. Some of the things that we're looking at in the future that we haven't quite dove into yet, but we intend to, is lithium-ion fire suppression, and just lithium-ion in general for central energy storage systems is coming up quite a bit. There's been a lot of it in the news, some events that have occurred and things like that. So informing the industry of what the potential hazards are for those types of things, we intend on trying to work into these requirements. Same thing with like customer telemetry and mechanical electrical monitoring. every hyperscaler wants to know data hall metrics in terms of Colo temps, return temps, valve position, flow. Those things are all very important, but we have to find a way to get the visibility to it without compromising networks. So compromising the building management system, power management system, all of that has to be coordinated very well. And internally, my kind of security team won't allow me to tie into these things directly, although it's very important to me. So we're going to work on how do we get to that point where we can have an API or something that's air-gapped and still get the visibility. Sustainability reporting is going to become more and more important, especially in Europe, as regulatory, as the governance for those regulatory commissions start to take over. We're going to need to start showing what our carbon footprint is. How much carbon are we utilizing? How much water are we using? These types of things are going to become very important. So getting to a point where we've got standard metrics on reporting will inevitably come up in the future. And kind of the last point here, there's a number of others, but what we're using for not only refrigerants, but also gaseous fire suppression is going to become more and more important. As we look at global warming and those types of items, these will become more and more important. And I know the EU just passed some new regulations on, I think it's fluorine-type gases for refrigerants and so on and so forth. So it's all coming down the pipe at some point. We just kind of have to adjust for it and try to plan for it. So what we're looking to, kind of our call to action is not only we need participation from other hyperscalers to ensure that we're getting the right specifications standardized. And I would say that no one company is right. We need to find ways to coordinate and find standards in the industry that we can get that are quicker and faster for the industry and also help us reduce stranded power. So with that collaboration, we can get to a point where we can find commonalities in the infrastructure that we can all work with. So participation from the hyperscalers is super important. Also from the co-location or the multi-tenant facility providers, we'd like to hear, like, through the process, because I've got visibility to the processes I run through, but not necessarily other hyperscalers. It'd be interesting to hear the troubles, what they run into daily with trying to actually get capacity sold, and where their biggest hurdles are, where do they spend their most time, and how can we make it easier? I think that will also reduce, when the data center is not occupied, obviously the suppliers are not making money, so how do we get people into the data centers quicker with the right specifications and standards? And again, our contact information is on the site here, but feel free to reach out. I think there's a monthly facilities call that we also host. So there's a number of ways to get involved, whether it's from a supplier standpoint, hyperscale standpoint. We would love to have cooperation from other streams as well. So I think that might be the last slide. So I wanted to give some time also for questions, if there's questions in general. Is that good? I think, yeah, there's a mic there. There you go.
So when you guys say OCP ready, and you look at the OCP summit, you can't take a step without looking at the words AI and liquid cooling.
Yep.
So how are you incorporating that? Like, a lot of customers might be looking for data centers which are, when you say OCP ready, which are really AI ready, but to host high density racks or
yep.
Has liquid cooling capability, has chill water provisioning and things like that. So do you have any plans to incorporate all that criteria into OCP ready? Or
yep, that's a great question, and that's our intention, is to look at, the future of compute looks different than it has in the past. And so finding a way, especially with multi-tenant facilities, you've got interconnection on, for instance, the processed water side. I know for certain if I were to go and deploy in a water-cooled system and I had concerns with another tenant having ability to operate valves on that processed water system, I'm going to be very afraid. Because if they make a mistake, they also take down my systems. So there's things that need to be incorporated, and I think that's where the collaboration comes hand in hand, is how do we find an acceptable way to give liquid cooling, but also reduce the risk that every hyperscaler is going to inevitably want. We don't want that shared fate risk between one data hall to the next, but it doesn't make sense to put in multiple central plants. So through our processes, we intend on trying to work through how do we get to that point and not share proprietary information about the racks necessarily. So we've got some things to work through, but I think we can get to a point where we've got a demarcation point with standards that could potentially work, and we don't necessarily need to know, how many kW are in a rack or what the flows are, and try to get to that point. So, but good question.
Just have a question. First, thanks for using her facility as your example.
Yes.
And the point I wanted to bring was more on the network side. So I know a lot of the hyperscaler have really strict networking range from the regional gateways. So how do you plan on kind of integrating that to make it easy for them to search for extra capacity?
So with the networking side, what we've, depending on the facility, right? So built to suit's kind of a different animal. You've got, usually it's a single tenant facility. You can kind of dictate how those networks look. On a multi-tenant facility, largely you get the kind of the meet me rooms, right? Where the carrier fiber comes in and you cross connect at that point. So what we've done in the past anyway is keep those carrier meet me rooms or patch locations completely owned by the service provider. So that way there's no, you can't get in and make cross connects. Go ahead.
Yeah, that wasn't really the question. It's more about, as a site selection manager, what I understand, they're looking at a range from where the network is. So how could it be provided? Because right now you can see, for example, our facility Q-Scale, we're in Canada, you can click on it and stuff, but how can that person actually start and do the due deal on the network, which is always the first step into buying. So I'm just coming in with that idea and how to provide geographical coordinates and stuff to allow people to do that kind of due deal on the network right away.
Gotcha. So with physical location and fiber distances, our aim was to document locations. I don't know that we had anything from a carrier point of entry, aside from standardization on redundancies. I don't know that we had anything in the specifications for geographical distances to, major fiber pipelines, things like that, although it could be potentially added. A lot of times when we're evaluating new networks or new regions, it's usually a business opportunity or a driven function from that standpoint. So some of that gets a bit tricky, and that falls a little bit outside of what we can plan for necessarily. Go ahead, Mark.
Just to add to this, certainly within the site assessment, there is a free-form box where a data center can provide information about which carriers that they support, that they're carrier neutral is one of the attributes that we're looking for as an optimum requirement. So we certainly do ask for information on that, and yeah, we want data centers to be as open as possible with any type of data that they think is going to be useful for attracting their customers. So yeah, we're certainly open to allowing that information to be shared.
So my question is a little two-sided. It is, are there, in OCP Ready, is there a rating around design, as built, operate? And then would it tie into uptime rating at any point in the future?
So right now there's no tie to, so there's standards within being concurrently maintainable and some of the Bixby standards. There's not necessarily a certification or a rating based on, a tier or uptime. A lot of that, I would say, so the hyperscalers essentially will go through and look at redundancies and availability and try to find the vulnerabilities within the infrastructure. So right now we haven't included anything in terms of a particular facility rating, for instance. I think that's potentially something that could be considered. We've kind of somewhat intentionally stayed away from some of the tiered ratings. Some of those are financially, you end up having to spend some money to do those things. And so the questionnaire and kind of the self-certification helps answer some of the questions and get the answers out there that we need in order to do an assessment, but not necessarily guarantee compliance with the particular entity, if that makes sense.
The only thing I suppose you could, where it could be related to uptime is we ask about TIA 942 as part of the a list of certification questions that we're asking for Colos to provide around design, around security certification, and what the equivalent would be if, for instance, the data center could be in a different part of the world, to the USA. And we're also asking, we're not saying that the certification in maybe in China is not suitable, but also asking for equivalents to the certification list that we're providing. Okay, I think we're at time.
Can I have a question?
Oh, no, okay,
Yeah,
one more
just
question.
A couple things. One, bless you and good luck. I'll try to hop on the monthly calls that you were talking about. And if you can answer this, great. If not, food for thought. You mentioned it a little bit about multi-tenant, and then if you're a single tenant and things like that. But will there be categories for, well, let me back up even another step. Do you have assumptions along the lines of single tenant or multi-tenant? And do you plan on having categories for single tenant in a data hall, single tenant in an entire data center where you don't have a shared core, and then multi-tenant where you have shared critical infrastructure?
So this hyperscale assessment was primarily looking at multi-tenant in terms of usually a data hall requirement. So reservations anywhere from 3 to 5 megawatts per data hall, looking at taking an entire hall essentially. So less of a single tenant although it happens, a multi-tenant facility turns into a single tenant facility because that tenant buys everything. But this was intended to be more so on that. You could have multiple tenants if you needed to, separate utilities and things where you get the kind of separation of risk between the tenants that's required by the hyperscale companies. But it's a good point. One of the things that we are looking into is if we're going to come up with standards for a multi-tenant facility, ideally those would mimic over to a single-tenant facility in terms of some of the base requirements, because in theory they really shouldn't change all that much. But it is something that is worth a deeper analysis. You bet. Very good. I think we're at time. So thanks everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much, everyone, for your attention.